Welcome back to Utopias. Today, I'm very, very happy to welcome a rising star in the United States Congress, Representative Ro Khanna. And Ro Khanna is someone I've known not closely, but I've been connected to for several years, thanks to some mutual friends who are part of the Young Turks. And Representative Khanna and I discuss the big question that I think is on many of our minds. How do we make America work for everybody? Especially at a time when, we're concerned about the elections, artificial intelligence, climate change, wars in different parts of the world, and much, much more. So Representative Khanna is one of the smartest, most grounded, most logical, and quite conciliatory while having strong progressive views members of the United States Congress. He's a leading voice in the House of Representatives, working to restore American manufacturing and technology leadership, improve the lives of working people, and advance United States leadership around climate, human rights, and diplomacy around the world. Representative Khanna represents California's 17th Congressional District, right in the heart of Silicon Valley, and is serving his fourth term. Prior to serving in Congress, Representative Khanna taught economics at Stanford University and served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce in the Obama administration. He's written two books, Entrepreneurial Nation, While Manufacturing is Still Key to America's Future, and much more recently, Dignity in a Digital Age, his newest book that we discuss in quite some detail in this conversation. Khanna graduated Phi Beta Kappa with a BA in economics from the University of Chicago and received a law degree from Yale University. As a student at the University of Chicago, he walked precincts during Barack Obama's first campaign for the Illinois Senate in 1996. So enjoy this conversation here on Utopias with one of the leading voices in the Congress and one of the most interesting voices in the United States Congress, Representative Ro Khanna, here today on Utopias. Very, very honored and very happy to be back in conversation with you, Representative Khanna. I saw you making the media rounds last night after the State of the Union speech and even before, and some of the things you posted on social media also about President Biden's speech. I want to start by just asking you where we're at as a country, where we're at as a democracy that has real power and energy behind it. I think President Biden set up a contrast between a move toward fascism, a move toward exclusion, which we see really represented by the former President Trump, versus the possibility and the ideal of living in a vibrant, pluralistic democracy. And what I want to start is by asking you about some of the issues that could get us there that he called attention to, but may not have put as much political weight behind as maybe some of us who identify with progressive values hoped for, from paid family leave to the expiration of the child tax credit to $15 minimum wage or the John Lewis Voting Act. These are all areas where he signaled support, including last night, but at various points during his first term, we didn't always see certain steps taken, like ending the filibuster. And I know that politicians have to make calculations around what they should go for, but I wanted to ask you about how we actually can realize the energy behind the idea of a multiracial, pluralistic democracy as a contrast to what we see occurring with potentially the onset of various types of neo-fascism related to President Trump, former President Trump.
Well, Rich, thank you for having me on. Thank you for your own writing, which is so powerful on so many issues of technology and democracy. I thought the president was fabulous last night in articulating a vision of what America stands for: compassion, decency, inclusiveness, respect. And he said those are the values that he's going to be fighting for, and they're at stake because Donald Trump is offering a very different vision of America, one that is hateful, that is exclusive, that is not open to immigrants, not open to people of diverse backgrounds, not open to recognizing women's rights. And so he really made a contrast of values. But I believe you're right that one of the reasons that we've had a harder time becoming a cohesive multiracial democracies, there are too many people who are not benefiting and aren't feeling secure in the system. They're upset at the system. Their jobs have been offshored. They can't afford childcare. They are in jobs where they never get any vacation. They don't have wages that have kept up with the cost of groceries or the cost of rent. And so a new economic bill of rights, a new commitment to economic revitalization, in my view, is a predicate for building a cohesive multiracial democracy. And the president articulated some of those goals. And now what we need is an articulation that we're going to really be willing to fight for them, be willing to overturn the parliamentarian to get a $15 wage, be willing to actually push for childcare and deliver on it this time, Medicare expanding to dental and vision, getting a paid family leave. So the agenda is there, but you're right. The Democrats are going to need to really fight to make it reality and have institutional reform, like getting rid of the filibuster.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you said that, because I think that's where the energy behind where we can all get behind the president could come. And it's sort of the sense that some of us have that, many of these policies that you and I just discussed are ones that are supported by over 70+% of the American public, including Republicans. And this whole idea that that we're either Republicans or Democrats might be sort of absurd, because in many ways, what Americans want is a sort of humane, vibrant, democratic possibility. And I guess I want to say that because it seems like right now in this country, the biggest movement leader is actually President Trump, in the sense that there's a very established, energetic Make America Great Again MAGA movement tied to people like Steve Bannon and others, online armies, etc. And it seems like that's a movement that has a lot of energy, has a lot of affect, is riling people up. And I'm wondering what that counter movement is, a movement that is truly that sort of restoring something that is a multiracial democracy. And so in a sense, what I'm saying is not just sort of saying this country has great values, or I believe in these values, or there are a couple policies that we should take charge of, but actually building a movement that we can consider a pro-democracy movement.
Well, I think that's the progressive vision that was most famously articulated by Bernie Sanders, but also has now Elizabeth Warren and AOC and Maxwell Frost and a whole new generation of progressives, Pramila Jayapal, and is on the streets. And what they're saying is we need a just foreign policy. We need an America that stands for the rights of people across the world, and that means the right of a Palestinian state, living side by side with an Israeli state, and ending the occupation. That means understanding that we need not to have as militarized a nation with $1 trillion Pentagon budget and the overseas extension of military interventionism. That means on a domestic front, though, that we've got to really empower people and have Medicare for all, free public college, universal childcare at $10 a day, and give people an economic bill of rights. And so that is where the energy is in our party, the progressive energy. And I think the president would be wise to harness that energy as part of his coalition, as he did in 2020.
I completely agree. And all of those policies are really wonderful and important, and voiced by definitely yourself and the other colleagues of yours you mentioned. I think the issue is that there might be disconnects between what the president and some folks who might consider themselves mainstream or establishment Democrats have supported versus this progressive vision. And I'm wondering how all of you as progressives are trying to bring that energy into the mainstream of the Democratic Party, including party leadership.
Well, we've been vocal and advocating for these positions, and I haven't been hesitant to criticize the president where we've disagreed. For example, on Gaza, I was in Michigan meeting with Muslim and Arab Americans, and I've really been pushing for a permanent ceasefire and a release of all the hostages. And we saw some of that language make it into the president's speech. He didn't go as far as a permanent ceasefire, but he said ceasefire on the State of the Union. He talked about the devastation and loss, not just of the Israeli lives in the brutal October 7th attack, but of the Palestinian lives that have been lost. And that's probably as far as a president has gone in recent history on talking about Palestinian suffering. So what we see is that the president is open to feedback from the progressive coalition, and a lot of the policies he mentioned last night, paid family leave, the importance of fair taxes on corporations, the importance of preschool. I mean, these were child tax credit. These were progressive ideas that we've been pushing.
No doubt. And I'm really hopeful that the energy that is connected to those ideas that are really being voiced by you and others are ones that can actually take root in the president's campaign, in contrast to what might loom with the energy of the MAGA movement. So I want to sort of ask you one other question about our democracy and how we really can make it stronger and more vibrant and more pluralistic. And then I want to ask you about the digital economy and other topics. So I love your book, as you know. I think it's really communicable to a wide audience. And I appreciate that you were able to put together such a substantial book while serving as a congressman. And in the book, the foreword of which is written by Amartya Sen, former professor of mine and a huge influence on a number of us, and former Nobel Prize winner in economics, but blurs into philosophy and other questions of choice and democracy. Amartya Sen actually quotes and cites the philosopher John Stuart Mill with the position that democracy is not just about, everybody voting, which we know doesn't happen in this country. We also have things like the Electoral College that block even a direct democracy by voting, but is actually what John Stuart Mill says, that's cited by Sen, is democracy is governance by discussion. It seems like, even as we saw to some extent during the State of the Union last night, with the folks in Congress, that it's become difficult more than ever for us as Americans to actually have discussions with one another, let alone debates. And this is the foundation of liberal democracies, as you know, and tolerance of other positions. And I know part of that is social media, but part of that also might be all the economic precarity that Americans are facing, the absence of passage of many of these policies we just discussed. So I wanted to ask you about that, reviving this idea of the public sphere. You cite and engage with authors like Habermas and Martha Nussbaum and others in this great book. And I feel like the foundation of getting to where the president is sort of saying we can get to is reviving a sense that we Americans can actually talk to one another and listen to one another.
Well, Ramesh, I think that's very well said. And I cite you and engage with your work too, and in the list of luminaries that you mentioned. And I've been influenced by your excellent writing on how we structure a digital sphere to promote deliberation, because it has to be intentional. One of the places I think I cite you is where I talk about the printing press and how it was not automatic that the printing press led to sort of robust democracies. There were pamphlets that actually were causing wars, and pamphlets of huge misinformation. But Europe and America built the institutions of liberal democracy and the town hall, and turned that technology into something constructive. And we have to do that architecture, build that architecture, as you write, in the digital world. To me, that almost building is more important than simply regulating. And in a simple example, what are we thinking about in a modern town hall online looks like? And why is it that the mode of communication is simply a viral TikTok video or a viral tweet, and that we don't have other interesting engagement of living room-like conversations online that attract a diversity of participants? And how can we get to that point? So that's a broader philosophical question that I think we all have to work towards over the next 10, 20 years. But in the more immediate, I love the president's speech. I thought it was very and appropriate, and what he needed to do. But one thing it was not is bringing the country together. I mean, I think it's almost, that was the original aspiration, and it's almost somewhat lost in this hard fight against Donald Trump. But at some point, and maybe it's post-Biden and Trump, we have to figure out, how do we engage with people we disagree with? How can the president talk about understanding that we are very divided in this chamber itself? Yet I call for members to have some form of respect and civility as Americans. And how do we have almost truth and reconciliation of where we've been and move forward? And some of the anger comes from economic precarity. Some of it comes from the difficulty of the project we're undertaking to become a truly cohesive multiracial democracy, and the tensions that poses between the new and the old, between the new traditions and ways of life and the way of life people have known for generations. And I think empathizing and acknowledging that, and figuring out what then can be a common purpose, bringing back robust manufacturing, not just in terms of jobs, but in terms of a common call for Republicans and Democrats, and how we do that. I think that's very hard to do in the context of running against Donald Trump. But post-Trump, we need to figure out how do we do that.
Yeah, and for everybody who's listening or viewing this, please check out Dignity in a Digital Age by Representative Ro Khanna. One thing that's I find very impressive about you, which actually almost models where I hope and we both hope that the country will go to, is how you have worked with and have very conciliatory and very logical and respectful ways of working with everybody in Congress. I've noticed that about you. You introduced legislation about bringing manufacturing jobs around things like chips and so on, chip production and so on, with Marco Rubio, senator, Republican senator from Florida. You've obviously worked quite closely with the administration and former Speaker Pelosi, yet you've always stood very, very prominently and directly for progressive viewpoints, which actually, as we were talking about, are actually largely embraced by the vast majority of the US population. We maybe shouldn't call them even progressive. They're just democratic, agreed upon viewpoints. So I want to ask you about that, how you've been able to take that approach, knowing that, some of your fellow members of Congress at times get in, turf wars and battles and yelling matches and so on. Like, how have you been able to operate within Congress? And do you think that that's actually more common than perhaps we see things as from the outside as American citizens?
I think there are more people like me than we see, but I think we need more of that in Congress. I mean, my approach would not be probably successful right now in a 2024 election, because what we need is to punch Donald Trump back and to punch back against a very aggressive Republican Party. But I try to avoid the personal demonization of the other side. And I stand strongly for my values: Medicare for all, free public college, taxing wealth, making sure that we have a more just foreign policy. But I recognize that people have different points of views, and I'll make my case and try to win the case by the force of argument and look for a common ground where we can find it and work with everyone. And I try not to launch into sort of a character attack or a dismissal of someone's humanity or perspective. Now, there are two ways of looking at it. Some may say, well, that's too weak. We need sort of a warrior while the other side is fighting, but which may be true in the immediate. But I also think we need people who are going to build a coalition, who are going to figure out how we reconcile this country, who are going to move us forward. And that's the role that I hope to be able to play.
Well, one of the proposals that you called for in your book, and I've seen you speak about before, and related to some bills you've worked on, is the idea of bringing manufacturing jobs back to America. You give several examples in your book. Bringing jobs back, recognizing that this digital world that has sort of taken over many of our lives involves manufacturing, involves labor, is really central. And what I wanted to kind of ask you about is, how do you kind of reconcile those industrial policy goals with immigration? Because perhaps some who would benefit from these jobs, at this point at least, have sometimes anti-immigrant viewpoints because they see their jobs as precarious, access to jobs as precarious. We know immigration is, by and large, the basis by which the United States has become the dominant player in the world economically. Yet, in many ways, your proposals might be to focus on existing, American citizens who might not reflect those immigrant populations, bringing those jobs back to them. So I wonder if you see any tension between those two, because I could perceive one potentially.
Well, what I am focused on is not just bringing jobs back, some of them which aren't coming back from the 50s and 60s that we may not want back because they were dirty and sort of an old form of manufacturing, but bringing the new manufacturing into the United States and leading, and that we have this enormous opportunity to rebuild America because of decarbonization and new industry and because of AI and technology, that we could bring new steel plants. Now, they're not going to be the 4,500 person plants with blast furnaces, but maybe they employ 800 to 900 people, and their hydrogen or direct reduction impacts, so less carbon emissions, and they're reindustrializing parts like Johnstown, Pennsylvania, or Warren, Ohio, that were deindustrialized. One of the things I think that we can show is that you're going to need immigrant talent to be able to reindustrialize the country. With the Chips and Science Act that I passed, we need to have immigrants who understand the advanced semiconductor production, because we haven't been doing it here, who understand some of the contributions on AI. And yet that can also lead to, at its best, to jobs that are for working class folks, that aren't for four-year degrees, and in communities left out of globalization. And that will show that immigration is working for communities left out of the modern economy. The problem has been that so much of the immigration has led to wealth generation and opportunity in Silicon Valley and the coast, in LA and New York, that if you're living in a community that has faced deindustrialization, it's very hard to see that the immigration has benefited you. It may have benefited America in the abstract. And our task is to link immigration with communities that have been left out of prosperity, to show that there is actually, it will actually help their kids have a better future.
Yeah, and you described this as economic patriotism, and I think that's interesting to try to take this term patriotism back, which is largely now seen as aligned with the MAGA movement. That patriotism actually is about bringing jobs back, as Trump says he would also do, but also recognizing that those jobs are going to create plenty of possibility for existing Americans, but also be able to build new types of jobs that can then build up the economy even further with immigrants and so on. So that's a tricky case to make. I'm really curious to see how you all attempt to do that. And specifically, I want to ask you about this relative to, for example, a policy in Germany that you're probably familiar with, which says that any company that has over 10,000 employees should have at least 50% of its board of directors consisting of employees from that company. And that might actually make it harder to outsource jobs and production overseas. Have you thought about policies like that, or do you think those are realizable? And what do you think about that?
I think the German model offers a lot to emulate in terms of the worker business partnership that led to industrialization. And Senator Tammy Baldwin has a bill from Wisconsin that I am on that talks about a third of a board having worker representation. So having some role for workers on boards, one, prevents the offshoring, two, focuses the corporate responsibility to a community, three, gives workers a say in how AI is adopted. Eric Bridgoffelsen's work at MIT points to the fact that we need these AI to be augmenting workers, not simply eliminating workers. And how are we going to do that if we don't have workers represented? So I think having a role for workers to be collaborative with business and part of the decision making is key to the future industrialization. And we can learn from Germany and some of those models. There are a lot of things we do better than Germany in terms of entrepreneurship and innovation and flexibility. But I think the German model of sectoral bargaining with unions and union business relationships and worker representation is worth studying.
And these, I think, are all models that can take some of the energy away from sort of the Trump sort of affect, which sort of just voices anger and exclusion, while at the end of the day serving massive corporate overlords far more so than anybody else, as we saw with the Trump tax cuts, which were astonishingly, in my mind, unfair for working and middle class Americans. One thing that I think President Biden did bring up, and I think the more he brings up things like this, the better, was the corporate tax rate brought into being at 15%, and inflation, for example, being at an all-time low, and unemployment being at very low numbers as well. Inflation certainly not an all-time low, just at a low compared to recent years. But I think the issue also continues, and this is something I want to talk to you relative to the digital world, that yes, there's less unemployment, but people are just not making enough money compared to the cost of living, right? Compared to the cost of housing, healthcare. You've spoken about this extensively. So I wonder how we can move from talking about unemployment toward underemployment, or where wages can go, especially in relation to where we're going with technology.
You're absolutely right to point to the central issue for most Americans, and that is that their wages haven't kept up with their costs. That the reality is that the jobs that they may have are part-time or are paying $17, not $30. So there are two things we need. One, we need a revitalization to create high-paying jobs. That is having workers on the board, that's higher minimum wage, but that's economic development. It's bringing new industry, new technology, new wealth generation, new small business to communities left out, because we need to lift up the economic earning potential, the wealth generation potential of communities, so that they're not just in jobs that aren't being able to sustain a middle-class life. And then the second thing is we got to lower the costs, and that is lower healthcare costs by having Medicare for all, so people aren't being fleeced with the premiums and the co-pays that they're paying. Lower the childcare costs. I have a bill $10 a day. That would be huge savings for working and middle-class Americans. Lower the housing costs. Say you can't have rent go up faster than inflation. You know, traditional economists say, oh, that's some kind of rent cap. It won't work and create shortages. I don't believe it. The empirical studies don't show that, just like a minimum wage doesn't lead to less hiring. So how do we have some control on rents? How do we have more housing available for first-time home buyers? These are the policies that we need, which is how do we lower costs and increase wages for folks? And that should be the central plank of the Democratic Party.
And I think that will create a lot of energy and a lot of excitement that can deliver on some of the things that President Biden was speaking about. So it's not just a sense that maybe some of us have that he's saying these things, but he and the Congress, and especially led by the Democratic Party, are working toward those things. So, of course, I must ask you about what has occurred with the datafication of life, right? As you and I both know, many different aspects of our lives are being turned into data. Digital footprints is a term sometimes that's used. When I, use my credit card, when I'm picked up by a surveillance camera, etc. Obviously, when I'm using social media, even our conversation right now on Zoom. Yet all this data is largely headed to the hands of private corporations. We know next to nothing about what data is being collected about us, how it's being used, how long it's being retained for, how it could be aggregated, for example, with data from data brokers, which are still legal in this country. And so this is not merely a privacy issue, because all of that is fueling an extractive and unequal economy, not just an issue with social media, but even with private actors like OpenAI and concerns around that, with new platforms like ChatGPT. So I wanted to ask you about specific proposals and ideas that you think are most salient and that we could actually get implemented around not just data rights, but also trying to set up mechanisms so this datafication of the economy can support every American and ideally people all around the world. So, there are a number of proposals, from universal basic income to portable benefits to data unions to breaking up big tech, as Senator Warren had spoken about when she ran for president. And there are other ones as well, regulating big tech companies as public utilities if they are dominant players. I'm wondering which proposals you think of as most possible to implement and the best ones moving forward. The last one I wanted to share with you also is the idea of public equity in all of these companies, a very progressive proposal that, if our data are being used to fuel these corporate engines, or they're using public investment like roads and the internet itself, maybe the entire public, to different degrees, should own some small equity in all these companies. So as Meta appreciates in value, we also gain accordingly, because Meta doesn't exist without us and our data. And we go there, we're the product and the service, right? In many ways, customer and the product.
Well, I appreciate it. And the Internet Bill of Rights I had introduced with Tim Berners-Lee and that we had worked on Ramesh together, I think starts to address that by starting very simply to say that people have to have a right to their own data and should be compensated for the use of that data. And that may be a small stipend that people get for giving their data to these companies, and then having a fiduciary responsibility, because you don't want these companies to be maximizing data that they don't need. And so having a fiduciary responsibility to using data only in ways that are actually necessary for a business function. And I think if Congress were to pass that kind of a framework, it would protect people more in terms of their data, so that they're not being targeted with algorithms that are preying on people's vulnerability, and it would also perhaps provide some compensation. In terms of the public equity, that's tax, right? And I think the most straightforward way to do it is what President Biden was talking about last night, that these corporations need to pay more tax, that the beneficiaries of these corporations, these billionaires and multimillionaires, need to pay more tax, and that we need a rational tax code in this country so that people celebrate the wealth generation, and then it can be used to invest in childcare and healthcare and education.
Great. And I think that's the foundation for, where we can go so a data economy works for everybody. So very quickly, one thing that you and I have communicated about in the past is recognizing that people get their news in this country on social media platforms dominantly, right? They are the source of news and they're monetizing news and in the meantime, threatening journalism in many different ways and the viability of journalists, organizations and companies even. The problem is that what counts for speech online isn't just speech. It's what goes viral, right? Whatever goes viral is
Right.
what's visible. So in a sense, this idea of the public sphere, as you describe in your book and many others do, as something where we all, in some sort of equitable way, are able to really talk to one another and listen to one another, is confounded by the invisible kind of architectures of these social media platforms that take the most extreme speech and the most hateful speech and make often, or at least inflammatory, and make it most visible and viral. And the former president was an expert in doing that on Twitter and now on Truth Social and other platforms. So we can't have a public sphere online if the extremes are what come to us, or our existing biases are confirmed. So how do we deal with that issue? I mean, one idea that we've discussed is having stakeholders involved in auditing and designing these algorithms. I'm wondering what you think at this point, given conversations you and I have had and you've talked about for many years on this topic.
Well, one is we certainly need smart regulation to make sure that people aren't preying on folks' data, that they're not, that they're transparent about the algorithms that they're using, that with children, that they're protected so that they're not getting the worst of the junior high experience on steroids. But I think it's also about constructing institutions and having many discursive spaces. So one of the things, not to be too philosophical, but when Habermas writes about the ideal speech society, he's talking about very strict conditions, not virality. You have to respect the other person, you have to listen, you have to have not distorted resources. And it's this ideal speech that exists in very few places. But then in his subsequent books, in Facts and Norms, he says, look, in the real world, the ideal speech condition may not exist. And so what we really need is a multiplicity of discursive spaces. So don't just have a Facebook, don't just have a Twitter. Let's create many different types of forums. And the multiplicity of those opportunities will create room for constructive conversation. And I think what we have to be more creative about is we've got, okay, Truth Social and Twitter and Facebook, but I don't think we have enough multiplicity of spaces that are helping create more civil, thoughtful conversation and doing it in attractive ways that get people participating. And that, in my view, is a challenge for social, political entrepreneurs and regular entrepreneurs, is how do we create more possibility for thoughtful speech, that the role of virality has a place. You may want a Gaza protester to be viral, or someone very upset with the border to be viral. I mean, it's not that protest and anger doesn't have a place, but it shouldn't be the only form of communication.
And maybe there are ways of designing between these different systems, Truth Social and Meta, for example, where information can be shared across them, or even asking our friends at these social media companies to do some A/B testing to say, hey, if you sort of incentivized maybe doing things more slowly or deliberately, I mean, that maybe not that, but something like that, do you still get the engagement that you want? And I think there's just a lot of proposals that we can use to try to link these different systems together. So we're actually really talking to one another, recognizing fully well that life is very sped up online. So it's difficult to take that space to actually listen to one another. But at least if voices that are not just sort of fringe are dominant, that could get us a little bit further. And I want to ask you about your own sort of vision of this country and your own personal life as well. I know that your grandfather was involved with Mahatma Gandhi. That's amazing. People in my family were as well in South India. I know that was a big inspiration for you. And I see you as someone who is going to continue to lead in many different directions. So I want to ask you about, obviously, on one level, your own political career and where you see it going. But also, the name of this podcast is Utopias, not because we truly believe utopias exist, but because they're sort of guiding lights for what the world could look like, what the nation could look like. So I want to ask you about your ideas of your own political career, as well as your own vision for this country, and maybe on a larger level, the planet moving forward.
Well, I appreciate that. You're right that a lot of my inspiration initially for public life, public service came from my grandfather, Amarnath Vidyalankar, who worked with Lala Lajpat Rai and then was in jail in the 1940s as part of Gandhi's movement on Quit India. And that gave me a sense that politics was a very noble calling, that people could shape more just nations and communities by active public participation. I think we have this incredible opportunity, our generation does in America, that we are now the beneficiaries of so many struggles for freedom, the struggles of our founders in this country to found a nation based on principles of equality and liberty, the struggles of those who scaled the cliffs in Normandy to defeat tyranny, the struggles of the civil rights marches for equality, the struggle of freedom movements like my grandfathers and your relatives for independence and equal dignity of the global South, the struggle of anti-apartheid, the struggle for having a Jewish state after the Holocaust, the struggle for a Palestinian state after occupation, and all of these strands of movements of justice and dignity sort of are enmeshing in America, which makes it our politics so challenging in part, but it also gives us the possibility of being inspiring. And what would be inspiring is to truly become this cohesive, multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy that's never been done in the history of the world, that Frederick Douglass prophesied in 1869 in A Composite Nation. I end my book just about his speech because it's such a brilliant speech, and that is our opportunity. And if we are this multiracial democracy, I think our imprint on the world will also be more just, because by having these perspectives, we will be more thoughtful about the dignity and aspirations of people in other parts of the world. And so that is my hope for America, that we become this pluralistic, cohesive nation that leads in seeing the aspirations of other nations also be fulfilled along lines of dignity and justice.
And as a professor at UCLA who is always teaching courses for the last 15 plus years to 18 to 21-year-olds, many of them have come to me and said, hey, I don't really know what's going on in this country, in this world, with climate change, with the fact that they are the first in the history of the country to make less than their parents, as you know, even if you control for inflation. Rod Chetty's work at Stanford and others show this. Do you have any message that you want to share to them, recognizing that they are our future leaders?
Well, I would say that they have more power than any generation, because they can get their voice out on social media. They can organize. They're so well informed. They're passionate that this country is ready for generational change, not this election cycle. But I think after this election cycle, you're going to have a lot of new people in politics, and that they should get engaged, and that they can help us become this multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, because they get that, and they can help us create the economic changes that are necessary to give people a real shot at the American dream. And if they don't have a shot at the American dream in this multiracial democracy that we have, then people will have a nostalgia for the past, which is not constructive. But if they can have the economic change, and if they can understand the role of climate in that, then they can build an America that could be our finest contributions to human civilization.
I love it. All about renewing our democracy through real applied proposals that people can actually get behind, moving beyond these partisan boundaries and bringing some energy back to our country as we think about technological and other shifts and forthcoming elections. Thank you so much for your time today, Representative Khanna. Really appreciate being in dialogue with you always.
I appreciate you. I appreciate your work and your contributions to not just how we build a thoughtful technology that's consistent with democracy, but just build a smart, progressive movement, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
The Utopias podcast with Professor Ramesh Srinivasan is produced and edited by me, Phoebe Browse. You can access episodes on all streaming platforms. And if you have questions or comments, please email podcastutopias@gmail.com. That's podcastutopias@gmail.com. See you all next time.